Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole, and in the second of our special shows looking at the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines, in this episode we'll be answering your questions as we give you the chance to ask the agenda. As the number of vaccines approved and the number of people getting the jabs goes up, there is a whole series of new questions to which the world needs some answers. To try and get those answers, I'm joined now from Seoul by the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, Dr. Jerome Kim. Dr. Kim, welcome back, first of all, to The Agenda. In a moment, I'll be putting some of our viewers' questions to you, but first, one from me, in other words, Stephen in London. There seem to be a large number of multilateral organisations involved in some way in the distribution, the rollout of vaccines. The World Health Organization, COVAX, CEPI, all in some way involved in the rollout. But who exactly is in charge? And should one organisation be in charge of the rollout and distribution of vaccines?
So I think that one of the unique features of the COVAX facility is that each organization that is in a leadership role is doing what it does best. So for instance, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, is responsible for vaccine development and manufacturing. Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, also the Vaccine Alliance, is responsible for the purchasing of vaccines, which is something it does extremely well. And of course, WHO is a normative organization. It's an international organization. It sets policy and helps to direct policy. So each organization has a specific role and responsibility under this. Would it be different if COVAX were a freestanding facility with an independent directorate? Yes, but it wouldn't be able to leverage the abilities of the three partners that are currently in the leadership role. 189 countries have signed up for these vaccines. 2 billion doses should be delivered by the end of 2021. This is a remarkable achievement, and I think that the organizers of the achievement should be congratulated on the one hand, and on the other hand, encouraged to deliver on the promises of COVAX.
Well, I have to say I agree completely with both of those thoughts, Dr. Kim. We also are hearing a lot about new variants, and our first question from the audience is about exactly that.
G'day, I'm Scott in Australia, and I'm wondering, do the existing vaccines work against the new strains of coronavirus?
So far, the answer appears to be yes, a qualified yes. The vaccine-induced immune responses don't work as well on the new variants as they did on the old ones. But we actually do not only have theoretical, test tube evidence that the vaccine should protect, but actually the data from Novavax and Johnson & Johnson, which were reported this week, suggest that their vaccines continued to protect, even in South Africa, where one of the newly emerging variants seems to be dominating the infection. So for now, they appear to be protecting. They don't do it as well as they do for the original set, and we're really going to have to keep a good eye on this. How do we decrease the number of variants? We're going to have to make sure that as many people get vaccinated as quickly as possible. So we need to control the epidemics that are occurring in countries around the world, but we also have to encourage people to continue to use masks, distancing, hygiene, avoiding crowds, because we need to really control this. And the best approach right now is going to be a combination of distance, masks, and avoiding crowds, as well as vaccination.
That's really interesting, but I'm going to butt in here because this next question is particularly relevant to me. I'm having my first vaccine today, and the vaccination is going to be the Pfizer jab. But what happens about the second jab? Suppose I get the Oxford AstraZeneca jab. Does that matter?
So I can give you the scientific question. The answer to that question is the vaccines were tested in a way that would only allow us to give vaccine A with vaccine A and vaccine B with vaccine B. Can we mix them? Probably. Will they work? Possibly. Do we know that? Does the data support that? We don't have any data to date on whether that actually works. And when you're doing vaccine studies, when you're recommending vaccines, you always try to stick to the vaccines that were tested. In that case, it would be The Pfizer vaccine with a Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine with a Moderna vaccine. Could it work in theory? Yes. Do you want to take that chance? If possible, we would like to avoid it. And actually, that's what most of the guidances say. We understand that there could be accidents, there could be problems. The other thing that we know is that, a single dose of vaccine actually does probably work. We don't know for how long, but looking at the data, 10 days after the first vaccination, we start to see a drop off in infections. So again, there's a lot that we don't understand. The vaccine dosing needs to be optimized. Could we give a half dose that works as well as a full dose, or might it work better as it did with AstraZeneca? These optimization questions are things that still need to be answered. So for now, I think that most guidances say, try to match the vaccines. If you're in a situation where you absolutely cannot, then it might be acceptable to use a different one. But really, the data are only for vaccine A with vaccine A, vaccine B with vaccine B.
So if I understand you correctly, a second vaccination isn't absolutely necessary?
No, not exactly. What it means is that the first dose of vaccine generates some protective immune response. That is, some level of proteins induced by vaccination that bind to and inactivate the virus. That's very important.
Right.
We always give the second dose because what we do know is that usually that first dose, the protective responses will decrease with time, and sometimes fairly quickly, sometimes less rapidly. So we need the second dose in order to boost up those protective responses, to give the immune system a reminder of what it's supposed to be doing.
Right, okay.
And we find that that second dose is often very effective. And also, one of the other things is when we're thinking about optimizing, these doses were typically given a month apart. If you start to space out the dose, there is evidence now from AstraZeneca and others that as you space out the dose, the protective responses get better. And that's actually really important and really needs to be documented scientifically. It's one thing to, do something based on what we think, what experts think. It's a completely different thing to be able to say to a patient or to a volunteer, the data show that the two vaccines given together are better than one vaccine, or that the two vaccines give you a much higher protective response that will last for a longer period of time. We really need to lead with the science in order to increase acceptance of vaccines around the world.
A question now from Mo Yazdiar, who tweeted us with the question, can vaccinated people still spread COVID? And I suppose he wants to know if they still have to wear masks and so on once they've been vaccinated.
Yes, so, and I think the answer to that is pretty unanimous. Vaccination is very important. Until we reach a high enough level of herd protection, we're going to need to keep the masks on. We're going to need to continue to use distancing, and we're going to need to continue to avoid crowds. At some point, maybe this year in the higher income countries, we will be at that level where governments can start to loosen some of the restrictions that were put on individuals. But until that time, we really do need to protect ourselves using a mask, and also very importantly to protect others. Almost all of the vaccines, so 7 out of the 8 vaccines that have shown efficacy so far, that is protection, were really designed to look at, does the vaccine protect against disease? The vaccines in general have not been tested to show that they protect against infection or transmission. And taking off your mask means that if you get infected, you probably aren't going to progress to COVID disease or severe disease, thankfully. But you could still transmit the virus to others.
A question now from Natasha on Facebook, and it's a pretty straightforward question. Natasha wants to know, will we be allowed to choose which vaccine we get?
Sometime later this year, there will be a time when there will be enough vaccine. Then recommendations will need to be made about which vaccine to use in which population. So will pregnant women get one type of vaccine and other people get another? And again, we don't know yet. The availability of vaccines that decrease infection versus those that don't could also be very important. Vaccines that prevent transmission. So again, these are data that need to be generated. Right now, the most important thing is to take safe and efficacious vaccines and vaccinate as many people as possible.
We've had a number of questions about the anti-vaccine movement. Dr. Kim, what do you make of this one?
Hi, I'm Camilla in Singapore, and my question is, a lot of people may not want the vaccine. Will that be an issue for the rest of us?
Definitely, the more people who accept vaccination, the sooner we will all be protected. So I think, and WHO has some very interesting guidance on this. First, lead with the science. Second, make vaccines easy to get. And don't complicate the systems for saying, okay, those people who are 64 years and 9 months or older, no, you have to make it simple. Make it accessible. Make it enable people. Make it easy for people to get the vaccine. The second part is provide positive socialization around the vaccine. We're doing this together. We are going to beat this if we do this together, if we cooperate, if we all get vaccinated, as many people vaccinated as possible, continue to use your mask. We need to create a positive social vibe around this. In Indonesia, they're vaccinating influencers because they want people to know that these vaccines are important, they're safe, they're efficacious. And if we want to go back to going to the pub or visiting our parents in nursing homes, we're going to need to have protection against COVID-19. And the final thing is motivation. How do we get people who are just, at home and they don't know and they may not want to sign up online? How do we get them out of their chairs? Well, governments need to figure out ways to communicate and motivate people, because really this is something that really is going to require all of us, our participation and our engagement in committing ourselves to ending this pandemic.
Should therefore vaccines be made compulsory?
A very difficult question. And it's easier to answer if you take a step back and you think, okay, why are we doing this? Well, in the end, it's the use of hospitalization and the number of deaths and the impact of COVID-19 on economies, not only the economy of individual countries, but on the world economy. There's a very interesting study done by the National Board of Economic Review recently. And what it said was, if we concentrate just on vaccinating ourselves, the global economy and high-income countries in particular will still be impacted by $4 to $5 trillion if we don't vaccinate other countries as well. It just gets to the idea that this is a global pandemic. It's affecting wealthy people and poor people, wealthy countries and poor countries. We all have to be a part of the solution. And, again, it's going to be difficult. Countries are going to need to come up with creative ways to encourage enough people to be vaccinated. When we reach a certain level, and that may be 70% or 80% of the population being either vaccinated or naturally infected, or both, then everyone will benefit. At some point, we will start to see herd protection so that the people who are vaccinated are protecting people who are not vaccinated. But to the extent possible, governments need to encourage everybody, 8 billion people on this planet, to get vaccinated.
In the Northern Hemisphere, spring is around the corner. A lot of people are thinking about their summer, they're thinking about travel. Now, we began this interview talking about the different organisations involved in the rollout of vaccinations and the vaccine. Which countries, which organisations are keeping track of who's been vaccinated and who can travel to where?
It's going to be really critical if we want to start traveling again, if we want business to resume again, that we have some way of being able to prove country to country that a person has been vaccinated. Are we going to resort to the yellow WHO vaccination cards? Or are we going to have some form of a vaccination certificate that you could put on your mobile phone and that will prove to a country that a person has been vaccinated? Those are going to be very critical questions. Otherwise, we're going to resume travel and people are still going to be in quarantine or still going to have extensive testing performed when they get to the country in question. So if we really are going to have a system that will enable us to resume a lot of the important travel that is related to business or economic activities, then we are going to have an international system that will allow us to be able to say with certainty and with confidence that person A or person B has received all the doses of COVID-19 vaccines.
Now to a question I think millions of people are asking around the world, including Nick on Facebook, who asks, I haven't seen some of my family for months. I have yet to be vaccinated, but my elderly parents have been. Can I go and see them?
It will depend on the rules in the countries that are where people happen to live. Yes, so medically, if you're wearing a mask, if they continue to wear masks, you do not have physical contact with them, things might be acceptable. Should they double mask? Possibly. What is the nature of the epidemic in the region? Are the variants circulating? Because again, the variants may be more transmissible and also more deadly. So there are still a lot of questions that need to be answered, and really governments are best positioned to evaluate the epidemic within their own borders, because each country is different. Korea at this point doesn't have a lot of circulation of the variants that are circulating in the United Kingdom or in South Africa. But it could be that, if an explosive outbreak of those variants occurs and the government is very concerned, then they may put additional restrictions in place. So again, it's been a difficult year, I have to say. I haven't seen my parents in over a year also. And it's going to be really important that when we do, that we absolutely are careful that they're going to be safe. It would be horrible for them to have survived through a year of pandemic and then to be infected and have an unfortunate consequence.
That indeed would be horrible, and the last thing we would want is for families to get infected now. And Mark on Facebook is asking, how will we know when our immunity runs out and if we'll need to be vaccinated again?
A great question. And so I'm going to get a little technical, but it's actually a really important concept.
In very simple layman's terms, if you will, Dr. Kim.
Yes. So when you give these vaccines in one of these big trials, in one of the big phase 3 trials, what you do is you draw blood after a person has been vaccinated. And you take that blood and you analyze it. And what you may be able to find is a single lab test. We call it an immune correlative protection, but it's a lab test that appears to be related to protection. Once I have that lab test, it becomes very valuable because I can look in your blood after 6 months or 12 months, and if that lab test turns to 0 or becomes undetectable, then I worry that you might not be protected. It's also a great lab test because, these trials that we did, these phase 3 trials, involved 200,000 people around the world. Some people getting a saltwater injection, some people getting the actual vaccine. We can actually make the trials much smaller. So a trial isn't going to be 60,000 people, it could be 1,000 people. So smaller and faster. And it'll answer a very specific question. It'll allow us to potentially go to half doses much more quickly, or spread the doses out a little more easily, because now we can actually do trials that look at a lab marker rather than at COVID disease in people. And that's going to be really important because then it'll tell us, for instance, when we need to boost you, or if in fact we should worry that people might be susceptible to infection. So the lab test is going to be very important. We think that there could be information on lab tests later this month or next month, so by March of 2021. And that could be very important because it will really make our job as vaccine developers easier.
And finally, are you seeing light at the end of the tunnel?
A vaccine solution is an important solution. It really gives us our first really good weapon an active weapon in the fight against COVID. Until then, we were using distancing and masks, and we all know how effective that's been in many countries of the world. A vaccine is different, but a vaccine, remember, is only a weapon. And to really win a war against COVID, we're going to need an army to wield that weapon. And those are the people, the healthcare providers who are be giving those jabs to 8 billion people around the world. And we really do need a strategy. We need priorities. We need to be able to say, wear your masks, continue to distance until, this time. And then we can start easing off on restrictions. But really, it's not going to be a simple thing. And I use this all the time. I think Winston Churchill said this, right? This is not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. We now have a weapon. We have to be sure that we can make it in significant quantity at very high quality, and then we have to give it to 8 billion people. And that is a huge task.
Dr. Jerome Kim, thank you so much for joining us here on The Agenda.
Thank you, Stephen.
Still to come here on The Agenda, the big question, who should be first to get their vaccine? We'll consider the ethics of the fight against COVID-19. Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to The Agenda. The question of who should get the vaccine first is one which many countries are finding tough to answer. Many have started by vaccinating the elderly and the most vulnerable first. But is that the quickest way of controlling the spread of the virus? Is there a single one-size-fits-all approach? Well, joining me now is Dr. Jane Williams. Dr. Williams is researcher and medical ethicist at the University of Sydney Centre for Values, Ethics and the Law. Dr. Williams, who should be at the front of the queue?
Oh, it's such a good question and such a tough one because no, there is not a one-size-fits-all response. Unfortunately, it would be so nice if there were, if this were an easy fix. I think you have to decide what's important, you know, and that could be minimizing deaths. It could be minimizing the spread of infection. It could be minimizing social disruption or shoring up your health system. All of those things are obviously crucially important, but they all involve vaccinating different groups or prioritizing different groups when you've got a scarce vaccine. So there are some really difficult questions that need to be answered before you can make those decisions about who gets it first.
Lots of difficult questions, which I hope I'll ask you, and I hope you would answer them. Because, I mean, one argument goes that health workers are at the front of this vaccination program. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it, for health workers to be vaccinated first?
Yeah, absolutely it does. It makes sense because they are at risk of becoming ill themselves. They're at risk of spreading illness. And also they've been working incredibly hard, or depending where they are, but under really difficult circumstances. And I think there's a sort of measure of reciprocity that's involved as well. We want healthcare workers to show up to work and work as hard as they can under these horrible, horrible circumstances they're working under. And I think we owe them something in return for that.
For governments, this is the toughest question of all. Some governments say, OK, it's the elderly must come first. Certainly the UK government, the different categories, the over 70s, 80s, 90s, most at risk. Other governments have decided, OK, the economies the economy of this country is so badly affected, we need to vaccinate the workforce. What kind of ethical decision-making comes into play there?
It's very common when you're talking about public health ethics, certainly, to think about what's going to benefit the greatest number of people. In a non-COVID situation, it would probably involve vaccinating in such a way that you knew that you were going to reduce the spread of infection. And so the kinds of decisions that we make around vaccination more broadly and that we're used to making around vaccination about protecting everybody and protecting the largest number of people might not be the same calculus when it comes to COVID. So you mentioned the UK government vaccinating the elderly. That is in order to minimize the number of COVID deaths, you know, and that's a very reasonable thing to do, of course. There's no correct answer, and I can't give you an answer, I'm sorry.
It is almost unanswerable, isn't it?
It really is, right?
But I was hoping you would be able to answer it. But which governments around the world do you think have got it right so far?
I think the New Zealand government did an amazing job. The Australian government has done very well also. It's been at some cost, you know, the national borders are closed. A lot of the state borders have been closed on and off. The hotel quarantine system is very tough, but it's very effective. We've done an amazing job here with contact tracing, especially in New South Wales, where I'm based. So really, I mean, I'm very grateful at the moment to be in the situation that we're in.
We're seeing in Europe and the UK something which is being dubbed vaccine wars breaking out, a general unfairness about the distribution of vaccines. I mean, we're supposed to be living in a time of globalization. That's gone away, hasn't it?
Completely agree with you. I think that's something that we've seen in the last 12 months has been very much every person for themselves, or every country for themselves, depending on how you want to look at it. There have been some really great attempts to try and hold that at bay. The COVAX agreement, if you like, is supposed to try to make equitable vaccine distribution, which will really help all of us. I hope very much that that's going to work, but there doesn't seem to be much sharing, shall we say. And of course, not every country has the same capacity to access vaccine.
You talk about Australia and New Zealand successfully flattening the curve. Do they now have a responsibility to help other less developed countries with their vaccination programs?
Yeah, I believe we do, certainly. And as far as I know, Australia's certainly made a commitment to do that with neighbours in the Pacific Islands to help them get protected. Because if we don't, I mean, I don't know when they will have the capacity to get vaccine.
Dr. Jane Williams, many thanks to you for joining us here on The Agenda.
Thanks very much for having me.
Ask the Agenda this week had many questions surrounding COVID, but among the most important were, do vaccines help stop transmission, and can I catch it again after I've been vaccinated? There are suggested answers to both in this week's programme, but those answers aren't certainties. And that's the problem for medical authorities and distributors around the world who are asking, how certain is the science? The good news for Britons is the UK is now vaccinating 70 people every 30 seconds, with 200,000 to 300,000 jabs delivered daily. Only 3 countries in the world have vaccinated a higher proportion of their populations than Britain, which is the best performer in Europe by some distance. Chief medical officers are cautioning, though, that vaccinated people should not assume they cannot pick up and transmit the virus. Even a smaller risk of infecting people becomes pretty big if the nation's newly vaccinated start throwing post-pandemic parties. And the concern is understandable. Vaccines that stop illness, which we know these do, are great, but the best way to protect a country, to end the pandemic, is to not just stop sickness, but to prevent transmission. And that means everyone getting vaccinated. And it's good to hear that some richer countries, including the UK, Canada and Norway, have intimated they will donate or at least distribute surplus doses to needier countries. And globally, the next challenge is not only to get those who are desperate to have the jab vaccinated, but also to convince those with concerns over the injections to set aside their worries. One Israeli health minister sums it up, hopefully, saying, are we seeing the light? Well, we see a chink in the blinds, and as Dr. Kim told us, quoting Churchill, this may not be the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. Don't forget you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at CGTN Europe. Coming up on a future Agenda, is the world doing enough to tackle the rising cost of addiction? But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.